Hey everyone, welcome to week 4. I just wanted to give you guys a quick video to go over our readings. You guys have a little bit more of a lighthearted discussion this week, so that should be good. Obviously it is very important, but also I think that, it's not quite as heavy as talking about death, destruction, suffering. So you should find that a little bit easier. Still, I think we should hold with the same method that we've been using for the last week. That is, spend half of your time, effort on these philosophical readings. Spend half of your time, effort kind of pulling out what you can from the religious traditions we're learning, which this week is Confucianism. So that should be very interesting, exciting for everyone. Okay, so this week in our philosophical readings, we start out with William James. Why they start here? So William James, writing about the 1800s, he's an American. Why they start here is because James sort of outlines what mystical experience is. So before James, we don't have a really good set of standards that we're using to evaluate. So some of the notes I took on him, thought it was super interesting. He was the first person ever in the United States of America to teach psychology. So he's considered sort of an American father of psychology in the academic sense. And that sort of shapes how he comes at this. He's looking for a good way to psychologically evaluate mystical experience. So he is one of the fathers of what's called pragmatism, and what that becomes really, that starts in America, and it's basically this notion that all thoughts, ideas, experiences should be measured by their actual impact. So practical application determines value. Everything in pragmatism, everything has to be tested by the standard of human experience, and that we live in a changing and adapting world. So something has to continually hold value in the world or continually impact the world for it to be important. He's very interested in mystical experience. He says that he values it as the deepest kind of religion. He also says that he is not able to have mystical experiences, so he's an objective reporter on others. He says that there's sort of 2 very important points, and then he provides 3 lesser sort of categorical points. And the 2, sorry, let me just get some light out of my glasses there. And the 2 most important aspects that define a mystical experience in his approximation is that it defies explanation. So when it's being reported, there's no words. People often have to define it against something or with relation to something, like it's extraordinary or it's supernatural, or I felt like internal peace that was like defined against the most tumultuous experience. So basically, he's defining them as sensory experiences that don't have a good solid explanation, definition. It's otherworldly. And then he calls the other one noetic. What this means is that these mystical experiences aren't just random. They are insightful, they make a nod at truth, and they're deeply important. So it's not just something silly. So those are the 2 things that every mystical experience has to have in his definition. Now, the things that it may have, generally it's transient, it doesn't last. They said, between 30 minutes and an hour. So it's not something that people continually have. Also, it's passive, so people aren't going out and saying, now I choose a mystical experience. The mystical experience is thrust upon them, and they are sort of left to sort it out. So those are the important things. The other things that he brings up is that they're very sensory. He thinks it's very important that they're happening to reliable, capable, smart people. They're defined by what they're not, which we talked about. He says often they include revelations. Generally, they're singular. So he's basically saying that mystical experience is not happening in group settings. This is happening to one person, and then one person is sort of trying to describe it. Intuitive. So it's something that the people just know somehow on their insides. Let's see. So the other thing that he does that's actually pretty cool and important given his time period is he says that these events have authority or truth over the people that they happen to. So, this becomes real in these people's lives. And we don't have to accept them, but we have to acknowledge that they could be another avenue to truth. So he's saying you don't have to agree with them, but you do have to agree that there's a possibility that these experiences could be getting us to another truth or another path to truth. He also says you can't argue with people's lived experiences, so once they've reported this, we have to take it at face value. Another very important point is that so unlike intellectual truth, the truth from mystical experience is not transferable, so it's not teachable. You can't go and help other people basically have your same experience. You can teach from it, but you can't give them, the way that you could acquire knowledge, you could then pass along to someone else. He's saying the way you acquire experience, you can't pass on to someone else, just like you can't make other people feel your emotions, you can't have them feel your experience, a mystical experience. So he also says that we need to take a lot of care in documenting these, that we have lots of documents in history, but we need to give as much care to documenting any mystical experience that are happening in our time as we do to examining historical mystical experience. He says that in general that these experiences are good for the people that have them. They get something out of it. And his sort of end of the day tie back into pragmatism. So pragmatism, you remember, is something is judged by its outward effect or its value in the world. So his final argument is basically that if God produces a real effect in people via this experience, then God is real. So that's sort of where the foundation of this conversation. So the next author that we read is William Alston. He's modern. He's in our time. And he is interesting because, so we read Plantinga, we read Craig. Alston works with them. They have sort of a coalition of scholars that comes up with ideas and works on things together. They are very focused on rational thought, and that rational thought is sort of enough. It's enough evidence. So they go back to, Alston in this article goes back to the perception of God. So you have a way that people are perceiving God, and he basically says that we can't question people's perception of God any more than we would question their perceptions of anything else. So when people say, I think that winter is cold because their senses tell them that, and we have that report of winter, we should hold that to the same standards of when people explain their perceptions of God based on their sensory interactions. So if someone has a mystical experience and tells us what they believe God is, we should trust their perception as much as we would their perception of anything else. So he basically kind of makes the argument that the faith of others is enough. So other people having these experiences, other people believing in God, is a good test, like a very solid, reasonable testimony. Just like maybe we haven't all seen, I don't know, we haven't all seen a flamingo in person, but we trust a zoologist's description because we can trust their senses. So his two big points are God exists, God is relatable. The reason that we know God is relatable is because we have reports of people relating to God. Pretty simple. An interesting thing that Alston does is he makes all faith traditions very valued. He basically says, you can't hold one experience of God over another. So he sort of opens Pandora's box in that way of allowing all experiences of God to come into the argument. He says we need to trust our senses. He presents all the objections that people have come up with. He defends them. Like I said, he's modern, so he has a lot of modern perspective. He also says that there's just no way to fact check. So we have to trust reason, and when reason comes up with a contradiction, so say there's, two people having experiences of God that contradict one another, then we have to trust history. So he basically says that we mostly should trust reason, but when faced with contradictions, we should look at, the past, history, church fathers, their experiences, and see what's the most congruent. So he doesn't really give a good answer for inconsistency. Okay, so then we get to Evan Falls, and he's the same time frame. He writes against Alston. He is a philosopher. He's very into physics, and his take on this is sort of that you can't rely on people's reported experience. There's just not enough. There's not enough evidence. He goes into the notion that some people are delusional, some of these experiences are going to be delusional, and that for anything reasonable that we have in life, we can cross-check it. And if you can't cross-check it, then you can't really use it as evidence. It's not a fair use of evidence. He really sort of pushes back on Alston in this notion that Alston gives no good answer for what happens when there's lots of different faith traditions that experience God in a different way. And so he says that there's too much variation. There's no way to create a mystical experience. So basically, one faith tradition hasn't figured out how to create these mystical experiences, so we don't know if one faith tradition can be trusted over another. And he goes into some logic proofs. So I know those are confusing and we don't really love them, but he spends 2 or 3 paragraphs on that. So what Alston says is, we don't check other sensory things. We don't double check when people say that it's cold, or people say that, this color is red. And Fales says, yes, we do. We go out and take temperatures. We make data sets. We study what red means and what the light waves are that create red. So he kind of dismantles Alston in that way by saying, of course we check each other. We've always checked each other with data sets. You can't just claim that perception's always been an acceptable scientific tool. He brings up a few interesting points. He talks about why mystical experiences are important. He talks about how they're often coming from socially marginalized people, that they are often achieving social justice. They often create people upward mobility or credibility for people. So he goes into, we need to examine motivations for people that are reporting these. He also spends a little bit of time saying that there's scientific evidence that, this could be like a temporal lobe defect, that people could be having mini seizures, and that he believes that you can induce a mystical experience with some sort of stimulation of the temporal lobe. So that's sort of what he brings to the table, is just a hard and fast opposition to Alston. Another place where he makes a really strong argument, but we don't have either of the readings, is the notion that prophecy has to be addressed. So Alston just sort of leaves prophecy off the table, and Falls says, no, you can't do that. Prophecy is one of the major miracles, mystical experiences we talk about in every major religion. So we have to address prophecy. Okay, we get to Hume again. I know that we have read a lot of his stuff. This one's a little bit more coherent, so hopefully you guys liked some of his later work a little bit more than his early work. He basically talks about the need for eyewitnesses and how the Gospels in the Bible fulfill that need for eyewitnesses. He does make a pretty emphatic view that we should trust eyewitnesses over our senses. So basically, if multiple people say something happened one way and we feel it happened another way, or our senses tell us it happened another way, we have to trust the multiple viewpoints. And so he brings up the notion of scripture over senses. So we have to trust what the scripture says over what our senses tell us. He brings in some interesting points on miracles and how miracles happen for the sacred and in the profane, which I thought was really interesting. Basically saying that there can be everyday miracles that don't necessarily correspond with something that's a faith tradition. Very much we have to rely on testimony, and the reason why we're probably reading Hume here is because in the end of this article, what he does is define what everybody else uses as the definition for miracle. And what that is a violation of the laws of nature or natural law. So from then on, we pretty much use that as the working definition. The next two authors that we read use that as the working definition as well. So let me see here if we're missing anything big on him. He does say that he believes that these understandings of miracles are products of men, but that testimony is important. However, the testimony of some of the ancient texts can be dismissed because, he goes so far as to use the word like these were barbarians. So he's basically saying everything we have for major religions comes before Enlightenment, therefore can't be trusted as much as testimony from people who are living currently. Okay, so then we get to Mackey. Mackey more or less takes Hume's arguments and says, I think he makes solid points here, here, and here, but here's where he could be better. So he is a modern author. He is Australian, and his life's work is sort of the notion that ethics are not universal and ethics have to be created within a culture. So he becomes famous because he presents one of the strongest arguments against free will. And so that's sort of where he gets his fame and notoriety. This piece is from what's called the Miracle of Theism. If you remember, we sort of read back and forth from Mackey and Plantinga. This is an answer back. So Mackey is answering back what Plantinga wrote him. So He basically says all religions have a supernatural reality. That's more or less what makes a religion, is that they have some connection to the supernatural. And that the reason that they present miracles is to gain some sort of religious authority. So he recaps kind of everything that Hume says. How do we evaluate testimony? People reporting miracles. How can we tell if they're dishonest? How can we tell if we don't see them? How can we tell that they are not, even if they don't appear dishonest, are they deceived? And that's why they don't appear dishonest. He basically makes it very clear that Hume's not arguing against miracles. Hume is just arguing against believing testimony of miracles. So Hume never makes a stance one way or the other about miracles. That's probably because, like we talked about before, he was living in a time when he could have been killed or exiled for his heretical writing. Okay, so Mackey makes the distinction that he refines the definition of miracle as not something that's a violation of nature, of a law of nature, but is above the law of nature. So he basically says, if we believe that we're living in a closed system, a miracle is an intervention from something external onto an event in a closed system. So miracles have to be external. Where he makes an argument that maybe miracles aren't real is when he sort of goes on this notion of one-offs of natural law. So he starts talking about how if you, it might be a miracle that you rolled a die and got a 6 10 times in a row, but also if you rolled that die millions of times, that eventually you may experience that sort of one-off or that odd combination that could appear as a miracle. So that's why that's sort of what he says. He also says that you can't test why a coincidence or a one-off happens the same way you can't test a miracle. So he holds that to be true. He also says that miracles can't be random. So he is agreeing that miracles have to be purposeful, and that one-offs in nature that occur that are just coincidental and random sort of hold a dispute for miracles. He points out a lot of generalizations and flaws in Hume. So he's attempting to make Hume's argument sort of more refined. He also says that Hume is operating under this assumption that there is such thing as laws of nature, and he says that maybe the laws of nature aren't laws at all. Maybe we just don't know about them. He says the most important thing is when you're looking at evaluating a report of a miracle that it has to have two things, and those are the people have to prove it happened and the people have to prove that it broke natural law. So if they can't prove both those things, then there's no reason to believe it. But he sort of ends by saying that the number of believers or the number of people that report miracles in and of itself is a miracle. It's a one-off in society. So he sort of says, like, there's no such thing as miracles, but maybe it's a miracle that we all believe in miracles. So he gets a little loopholey there, which is interesting. Okay, so our last author that we go on, right? Let me just double check. Okay, our last author that we were supposed to read this week is Peter Van Inwagen, and I don't know if that's correct. He is a modern theologian, and he's writing fully against Hume. So he works at Notre Dame. He, very similarly though, got his fame and notoriety for writing against free will. He makes probably the strongest and most academic argument against free will, and the one that most academics would probably accept today. and that's basically we don't control natural law, we don't control the past. Therefore, even if we had free will, like our lives are already determined, so really we don't have free will. He basically says that in a controlled world, if you're going to assume any sort of control, free will becomes kind of an incoherent idea, and he writes extensively on this. So if you guys want to check that out, this would be the author. If you are looking for someone who compellingly writes against the Augustinian free will idea, this is your guy. So he kind of acknowledges that everyone works off of Hume's definition, and he kind of tries to redefine that using some philosophy. He brings in some logic proofs, which are exhausting, but, probably helpful. I don't know if you guys find them helpful, but helpful for people who are more philosophy-minded. He repeats that Hume is not refuting that miracles exist, but Hume's offering instructions on how to approach reported stories of miracles. So one thing that he brings up is, when Hume was writing, testimony was the only evidence we had. So Hume's writing before we have any digital recording devices. So that's why he's so focused on testimony, whereas today we may have other tools that we could use in reporting these things. And he also basically says that experience isn't always reliable, and he uses this notion of Thomas Jefferson never experiencing a rock falling out of the sky. Thus, that's his lived experience, which basically Hume says you have to weigh every single thing against lived experience, and if it's contrary to your lived experience, then it's probably not true. He says that there is plenty of things that would be contrary to lived experiences that we would hold up as necessarily true. So he sort of dismantles Hume on that. The other thing that I thought was very interesting is he brings up this notion of maybe miracles were just very advanced technology that happened in antiquity. I thought that was a really interesting thought experiment. It was he just sort of threw it in offhandedly as almost like a sidebar tangent. But I thought that was a very, very interesting thing to mention, and it may be worth it if I can find some of his arguments or thoughts on that to share with you guys. So I'll take a look for those. Okay, couple quick minutes left. I don't want to ever take too much of your guys' time, but I'm going to bring up the high points of Confucianism. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this reading. It was a little bit shorter than the other ones. The most important thing, and I think Smith goes into detail after detail on this, is that it is Confucianism is very much a social movement. It is a set of ethics. It was a person who Confucius was trying to affect society, was trying to socially revolt, more or less. And that is where this sort of theology comes from. Confucius is focused on deliberate tradition, and what that basically means is on action, and on action that's happening here in the world, and on how we're living our daily lives, and very much less focused on what's happening outside of our lived world. So he talks about sort of the 5 tenets of life, the 5 most important things, and what that's called. He's got Jen, which is kind of goodness. It's love and respect for yourself and others. The second one is Chun Sao, which is us at our best. This might be what a good Christian equivalent is, sort of grace or compassion. So sort of access to God, he doesn't really go into God, but access to heaven through grace or through compassion. Li, which is the way things should be done, or your character, the way you do things every single day and the way that they should be done every single day. Ti, which is power or influence. But what the main focus of this is how people should be working together to exert their influence. And then Wen, which is peace. So what Confucius was trying to do is he was trying to focus on the world. He was trying to change the world. He was trying to make things better during his time, in his lifetime in China. And he does write extensively. So I think the most authentic view of Confucius would not really be as a religious leader, but more of a philosopher. So I think kind of like the best way to explain it is what Plato and Socrates were to the Greeks. Yes, they affected their theology. Yes, they affect their thought process and lives and how they conceive the world, but they're not really gods. That's sort of how Confucius would be in China. Not like a Mohammed, not even really a prophet, but a teacher, a scholar, a thinker. So he certainly doesn't deny heaven, and he makes a distinction that heaven and earth are interacting constantly. He believes that our ancestors are in heaven, that our ancestors continue to impact the earth, but do so from another world. And the conception in his time, which we have to assume he was more or less operating under, was sort of heaven and earth as like a yin and yang co-creators of our existence, our universe. So heaven certainly does have like the transcendent quality of God. But he's not concerned with the nature of God. He's not concerned with how God's acting, what God's doing in his life. He's concerned with what's happening here and now and how we can sort of achieve this whole goodness so that we can be beneficial when we join heaven. It's not so much that you need to do good things to get to heaven. It's you need to do good things because you have inherent goodness in you, and because there is inherent goodness that surrounds the world, and we need to strive to be a part of that and bring out the inherent goodness. So that's more of the Confucius model. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I think it's interesting. Tell me what your thoughts are on Confucianism as a religion. I think one thing that many of you talked about was how interesting you thought it was that Hinduism was more of a culture or a set of beliefs or a set of understandings. And I would say that Confucianism is very much the same. We're going to get into Taoism in the next couple weeks. So you'll have something similar to this to sort of compare and contrast. And it's always very interesting to see the way that the Eastern religions and the Western religions sort of live and are put together in these writings. So good luck this week. Email me if you guys need anything at all, and I will do my best to be in touch. But I look very forward to our discussion this week, and hopefully you all have a great week. All right, talk to you soon.